Hello, U of T. Welcome to Lecture 11, Part C, Take 2. So, you know that thing that happens to you periodically where you get some random jazz in your apartment while you're recording a lecture, which is maybe off a ringtone or something. And so you pause your lecture recording until the random noise passes, and then you resume your lecture recording. And what you don't realize is that, in fact, you've hit the button to pause it twice. So you resumed it during the pause so it can get your weird facial expressions and you flipping through a book. But what it doesn't then get is the entire rest of what you said. You know that thing? Yeah, that thing. Okay, so because it's always exceptionally painful, and that was like a random noise. Okay, so because it's exceptionally painful, if you've ever had the experience of attempting to re-deliver something you have already delivered. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that at great length, like you thought you had something and then you realize the whole thing is gone. The early days of Google Docs, sometimes you would get a random error on Google Docs, this is years ago, and it would eat your whole file. And I once had put, I don't know, 10 or 12,000 words of writing in and gone. No backup, right? Very frustrating. Likewise, I once lost 1,000 pages of notes towards a novel when a laptop got stolen and I didn't have it backed up. I've never been able to return to that book, which I still think is pretty good. It was the story of a confrontation between Leibniz, right, philosopher, and one of the inventors of the calculus, who, with the Duke of Brunswick, allegedly visited the Flying Friar, St. Joseph of Cupertino, which is probably one of the best documented cases of unpowered human flight, if you happen to believe in such things. Anyway, 1,000 pages of notes, gone. So I'm not going to do the fully elaborated version of this particular section that I had before, but like I said, tables of correspondence in general, and then I was kind of flipping through a bit on, right, the, I don't know, 9 Taoist psychic centers, right? You can see that's a table of correspondence, or, right, runes. Here we have a fairly classic Nordic system. But again, notice how these all have the same structure. I mean, they're set up that way on purpose here for reference point, but they're basically like spreadsheets, right? And they're spreadsheets where, in a certain sense, right, what you get is, right, magical models here. And what you have, right, you can see there are signs, and beneath that you can have, right, the various things that are the rows. So the columns are the signs, those are the sort of ruling powers, right? And then the rows are individual domains: angel, archangel, apostle, sent, direction, etc., associated symbols, this kind of thing. Hindu tatwas, right? So you get my point. There are loads and loads and loads of these across different cultures. They are in their own way like, languages. They're different ways of cutting up the world. None of them is necessarily better than another, although they might be better for individual things. But the general notion, right, is that any one of them, if it's sufficiently internalized, can be used as this constructive ritual framework, but also as a method of navigating interior space and structuring interior states, right, altered states. Okay. And then I had a bit, and I can't remember how I led into it. Oh, I know. I was talking about the Kabbalah, and I was specifically referencing I was saying that you have bits and pieces of this stuff in your environment. So around your house, right, it's very possible that you have a deck of playing cards. It's quite likely that you happen to know your astrological sign, and you may even have a horoscope, certainly on your, your computer or something. Maybe you have a piece of jewelry with your birthstone, right? And if you happen to be a David Bowie fan, as I am, odds are you might have a David Bowie album, such as the David Bowie album Station to Station. And what I said was that Station to Station is my favorite Bowie album. Were not for Station to Station, the song, which is also the title of the album itself, I would say my favorite was Diamond Dogs. But the point is, right, Bowie is a really interesting mercurial figure in and of himself. He's something of a shape changer, right? He has this sense of sort of performance and symbol and ritual that comes through in a lot of his work. And specifically in the period where he's recording Station to Station, he's in Berlin. He's neck deep in cocaine, which we've already touched on, right? Having that dopaminergic connection effect, right? Linking things together with excessive dopamine, the way that amphetamines and cocaine often kind of do. They can create that kind of paranoid ideation. But they also, with the hyper dopamine release, the hyper level of dopamine, right? So increased dopaminergic, right? They're going to tend to create that sort of linkage, which is precisely the sort of thing that these systems run on. At the same time, he's actively practicing magic, right? Thelemic, so Western tradition ceremonial ritual magic. And he's referencing that explicitly in the song Station to Station. If you've got Spotify, go listen. But it's like 7 minutes long, but it's a good song. And one of the lyrics is, right, Station to Station itself is a reference to the magical navigation. These things are sometimes called stations, right? Stations, like subway stations. And so to make, right, the magical, as he says in the song, one magical movement from Kether to Malkuth, right? He talks about being in the circle. And so, you know, he makes a bunch of quite specific references. The song is specifically about Station to Station. It's about magical work within this system. And it's also just a terrific song. So, tables of correspondence. Now, in general, right, we want to start linking that stuff forward. So let's do a little bit of a return, okay? And last time we were also talking about trust, trauma, and transparency. So we got talking again about this notion that in a day-to-day sense, right, there is a variable degree of integration within your system. In the theories of Giulio Tononi, right, integrated information theory, this stuff is called phi. Stuff. The mathematical property of integrated information is called phi, right? It's phi value or a phi complex. So the idea is that the information within your brain or mind is integrated information. And that is what consciousness is sort of made of, in a sense, okay? Integrated information from different sources. So he proposes that our main phi complex is likely to be the source of our consciousness, but his theory also opens up the possibility that there can be multiple phi complexes. And one of the things that the theory doesn't mostly address is the fact that we know that the information integration within the brain is sort of shifting in real time. So the brain goes through these variable states of, right, synchronization, and then gradual desynchronization, and then they sync up again, right? So brains go through this ebb and flow of synchrony and a kind of a desynchrony. I think I mentioned to all of you that I had in mind to do an exercise in a class, and it's a sort of a dramatic exercise on this basis, which if you're living with enough people, you could try now, or we can try it all in office hours tomorrow. So the idea with this is that you get a room full of people, say 20 or 30 people, and you get everybody in the room to start making a different mouth sound. It's like an improv game, right? You know, so babu, 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 and if somebody else is going wah, 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 wah. Okay, fine, you make different noises. But the game is then over about 10 minutes or something, you try to gradually shift your noise so that you're all synchronizing, so that eventually you're all in synchrony, making the same noise. And then you are all making the same sound in synchrony. And then at another signal, you gradually desynchronize it, right? Until you're out of synchrony. It's apparently a remarkable sort of shared experience, and it's something I've been meaning to play with a bit as a kind of instantiated way of talking about this, but that's happening in your brain all the time. When things are in a high state of synchrony, they tend to be integrated, right? This is one of the ways that we look at integration. We look at the firing patterns and stuff, and to whatever extent two different brain areas are, right, predictive of each other, right? When one fires, the other fires, that's how tightly integrated they are. So that level of integration and then sort of disintegration is occurring all the time. Different states of consciousness predict it, but it's also just occurring in the general processing of the brain, right? Areas sync up and then they desynchronize. As I've mentioned from the outset, right? Integration and dissociation are part of the integral functioning of the brain. They are a complementary set. So that's fine. In different states then, right? When we are sort of less integrated, we are more dissociated, there's more drift. And as the components, right, as the information level between them, the information exchange drops, they become less fluent. There's less fluency, less integration, less information exchange, less transparency from one to the other. And gradually, right, the information exchange then is relatively minor. At that point, they can mutually model each other in an important sense, right? Because they, right? But the point is they start to other. And if they go far enough, then they really seem to be other. So if you can imagine your main phi complex down here, and off comes this component, right? So that it's still connected, there's still sort of threads between, but like the normal flow of information is not nearly as tight, right? It's out here. Well, the phi complex, when it experiences that incoming data, experiences that as other. This is what's happening in the theory that I'm proposing to you in a vast number of states. It's what's happening in the kind of dissociative states where there are apparent externalities. It's what's happening in most of the states where people have sort of an experience of like an apparent figure, right? So like the third man factor that we talked about, right? And different kinds of things. Alien abduction, probably. There are some indications that maybe that's what's happening there. So when people experience the alien abduction, right, that's what they're experiencing. And all kinds of sort of anomalous experiences of that kind can be relatively easily accounted for by this system. There's a piece of the mind that peels off, right? Likewise, okay, things like hearing voices in a non-schizophrenic context, right, which is relatively widespread, can likewise be explained for that. The voices have an apparent externality. In the same way that when you're in the sensory deprivation tank, right, if you're in sensory deprivation in a float tank long enough, right, you start to get that drift and you start to get apparent externality. Things that seemed tightly integrated and internal, subjective to your experience, suddenly flip and start to seem outside of you. Right? So interior mental events suddenly start to become exterior mental events. And if you follow that closely, you can sort of feel it happening. Right? You can sort of feel that flip occurring as the two things, right, start to separate and encapsulate. Okay. So it's also happening in dreams. Now, that's important. And one of the reasons it's important, okay, is that process of bringing it together and bringing it apart and bringing it together and bringing it apart, right, turns up in some other contexts. So for instance, it turns up in certain kinds of network theories and something called simulated annealing. Simulated annealing is, of course, a reference to metallurgy. So annealing is a term from metallurgy, from forge work. Okay, so there's a brief detour on that. Okay, so let's say you're working the forge, right? Working the forge. And you want to make a sword, as one does. So you want to make a sword. So what do? Okay, so first you're melting down pure metals, right? So you obviously have to have smelted metals out of ore, blah, blah, blah. But you melt down pure metals in a certain proportion, right? Steel, for instance, is not a pure metal. It's an alloy. And so it's mostly iron and a few other things, right? Nickel, whatever. So you have to melt these things together, pure versions of these things in the appropriate proportions. You mix that stuff together, fine. And what you've got is a molten liquid, right? You pour the liquid into a mold. You've probably seen this, right? And then, okay, normally what we then think is like, okay, then you start beating that sucker. But the thing is, if you just pour steel or iron like that, in that way, okay, when you pour iron in that way, it's a crystalline structure. That's what you get at the end of the day in there, right? You get a kind of crystalline structure. And what I mean is, like, if you've ever done that experiment where you've super saturated a glass of water, right, with sugar, like you fill it with sugar, and then you drop in like a string with one sugar crystal, and you'll watch that, right? It'll crystallize into the space. Or you've maybe seen the same thing done where there's like an ultra cold glass of water, and then somebody like taps it and the whole thing flash freezes, right? You can seed crystals in this way. It's the same kind of thing. As the metal cools, it forms crystalline structures. Now, the problem is that the basics of that happening when you're forging, right, are you don't get great crystals. And every place you have a separation or a misalignment in crystals, you've effectively got a brittle structure. So what do you want to do? Well, you want to keep heating it up and cooling it gradually, and heating it up and cooling it gradually, because you're melting the small crystals and you melt the edges of the big crystals, but then the big crystals expand to take over territory, right? And so gradually what you're doing is welding together a bunch of small crystalline structures into larger crystalline structures down the length of the blade. And then eventually you do things like quenching and so on and so forth. That process of gradual heating and cooling and heating and cooling to expand to the crystalline structures and bind that stuff together is called annealing. And that's a technique that you also see in sort of artificial neural networks, right? And in some techniques of machine learning and stuff. Well, that has also been proposed for part of what's going on in something like the sleep-wake cycle, both in those kinds of networks, but also in terms of the brain, okay? And if you consider for a second some of the stuff we talked about last class about the role of different kinds of brain functionality, right? We know that we go offline and we know that we experience a degree of dissociation because our interior contents have the seeming externality, right? That seeming externality. So we sort of know phenomenologically that we're experiencing a form of dissociation. But in terms of actual brain structure, we're like, okay, like what the hell, what's going on there, right? And the idea is that in a sense, okay, yes, it has, as I mentioned last time, the ability to practice social material. When we are having REM dreams, we are consolidating we're consolidating procedural material, right? Skills. The skills that we're consolidating are skills of narrative and skills of social interaction for the most part. We do a certain amount of running and jumping and climbing and whatever. But most of what we do in the dream is practice social and emotional material, right? We have interactions with people in scenes and circumstances, right? That's the kind of thing we practice. Why? Because that is the source of the greatest threats of our environment. It is also the source of the greatest opportunities of our environment, right? And so evolution, has pressure to accept that basic like threat simulation into something much more elaborate for us. Okay, and then you get propositional consolidation in NREM sleep, right? These are the big empty cave dreams that I mentioned, right? With the lines of thought. Okay, but also importantly, in these cases, you want to be able to separate modules out to work on them. And this is what I've already mentioned when I've talked about the Nerathian bootstrap, okay? The Nerathian bootstrap. So that's a term that was sort of based on the work of Otto Neurath, but it got partly picked up and sort of popularized to some extent by Keith Stanovich, who is a rationality researcher. It's a fairly famous one in cognitive science. Okay, so what is this? So we already know the deal with the ship of Theseus, right? So the ship of Theseus is there's a boat. If you replace all the pieces of the boat, does the boat retain sort of its identity, right? So if you pry up all the boards and you replace the mast and you replace the keel, is it the same boat, right? Okay, and so we talked about that. The Nerathian bootstrap is a more practical question. It says, if you did want to replace a part, like pry up a rotten board, how would you do it? How would you do that, right? What are the actual mechanics of doing it? And what it sort of says is, well, what you need is something which allows you to hoist yourself off the deck, right? You need to be able to remove the forces operating on the board that you want to remove, right? And you need to be able to somehow keep the system otherwise intact and operating so that you can simply operate on the rotted board and pull it out and replace it. Now, when Stanovich brings this concept of the Nerathian bootstrap in, the way that he does it is he's talking about rationality, and he's talking about belief revision, right? So many times we've talked about this in class, the idea that when we check our beliefs, right, they all check out. We can look at our beliefs and they all look right, right? We eyeball them and we're like, no, that one's right, that one's right. But that's very unlikely, right? I look at that and I think, well, what are the odds that I am the only human being in the world who's right about everything? What are the odds of that? It seems low to me. Don't get me wrong. I think that I think my ideas are sound and my reasoning is sound for the most part, right? But that's the problem. Everybody thinks that, unless they have a lot of self-doubt. But most people think it, right? If you check against your individual beliefs, yeah, they all check out. And yet you check other people's beliefs and you're like, wow, I don't know how you believe that. Right? You can think when people are like, well, you have a weird belief about that, but that's fine, right? The point is, insofar as you have differences, right, you're basically saying, well, yeah, but my position is the correct position, right? Now, there might be things that you don't know about, but you tend not to think that your beliefs are false. And yet, necessarily, they almost must be. I mean, think about this for a second, right? A good example of this, and if you want to see a sort of an interesting documentary on this that I recommend to people sometimes, go check out the Netflix documentary Behind the Curve, which is about flat Earth conspiracy people. And, okay, so, but let's look at that for a second. Let's just for a second say that the Earth is actually a sphere, right? Okay. What that means is that, right, and relativity complicates the picture of whether the sun comes up or not a bit, but let's leave that aside. Let's just look at this for a second and say, that the Earth isn't flat, it's a sphere, and the sphere is sort of going around the sun. Well, what that means is that like everybody, other than the very few people, Galileo, Copernicus, the Pythagoreans, right? There were a very small number of people who thought that was the case. Everybody else thought the world was flat. And they took appearances, literally, right? The sun comes up in the east and it sets in the west. Like, what else could be clearer? And the world isn't moving. Like, it's the clearest thing in the world, right? But they were wrong. They were all wrong. And that's the thing. They were all wrong. It's not that it was a bad belief on the basis of sort of accessible information. It's just that when they took finer information, when you take more accurate calculations of the movement of the heavens, stuff stops making sense. It's harder to account for, right? But the point is, like, every one of those people would have checked that belief and said yes. The same thing happens every time we have some kind of revolutionary shift within science, right? There's a consensus belief, and then enough counter evidence builds up until there's a paradox, and boosh, right? And then all of a sudden, right, some other kind of belief or set of contradictory beliefs comes in. But the point is, like, maybe as a fluke, maybe there's somebody in the world who's right about everything, but it actually seems unlikely to me. Okay? So, but here's the thing. Our beliefs tend to be tightly tied together. So how do we operate on beliefs, right? That was their question. How do we pry up the boards of the beliefs in our ship of Theseus without the whole thing going to hell, right? How do we operate on this stuff? And he proposes this concept of the Nerathian bootstrap. I'm less concerned with beliefs per se, right, which are simply propositional, than I am concerned with models. Models are predictive, and we've talked about this with mutual modeling, right? And we have all these mutual models of other people, our brain maintains mutual models of its own behavior at different scales, but then we also have mutual models of other people, right, our loved ones. We have mutual models of type. We have mutual models of animals. We have mutual models of circumstances, right? We have models that carry expectations about what we believe about the world. I believe the sun is going to come up tomorrow, right? I believe that. But that's a model. The fact that I believe that and I operate accordingly is part of a model. And as Hume pointed out, like, it's not necessarily the case. It might not, right? I think it will, but I don't have sort of a hard philosophical reason to believe that. It's an act of faith in a sense. And it's a predictive capacity. My brain has the world modeled. I've seen the sun come up a lot. It seems to do that fairly consistently. I have it modeled. So my beliefs about the world are in no small part enshrined by these predictive models, okay? And my beliefs about the world, again, like we talked about with the sort of relevance of social operation within the dream space, my beliefs about the world, the ones that really matter, are my beliefs about things that can, opportunities and threats, right? And most of my opportunities and threats are other human beings. It's the social environment. There are things that I want to know. Like, I want to have a reasonably good prediction that if I jump off of a 100-foot tall building, I am at the minimum going to break my legs and I'm probably going to die. That's a pretty good prediction, right? And it's going to stop me from endangering myself in some way. But most of what we're doing, if you think about it, like, think about the way that you're navigating your day. And most of what you're doing that is sort of consequential to your overall flourishing or death, right? Flourishing or failure, not that death is necessarily failure, but you take my meaning. It's about navigating the human environment. It's navigating the social environment, the cultural environment. Okay. So the kinds of belief prying up that we're talking about often is about prying up our beliefs about other people. Our models, generally speaking, but most of those models are about people. Now, those models, sometimes, if we think they're good models, if we trust them, then we believe that they either predict the behavior of other people accurately, we have a good sense of those people, or we take them to be so trustworthy and valuable that we internalize them, right? We operate through them. So this is like picking up patterns from your parents, right? Which you then proceed to roll out over the course of your life, sometimes to your frustration, right? Because not all these things are always lined up. Of course, it's very possible for us to have one model that gets us to do one thing and a belief about something else, right? All the time, we have these inconsistent feelings. And as you said, this is one of the arguments that I made right at the outset for a psychodynamic hypothesis, right? Being of two minds, right? Having one set of beliefs, but also doing something else. We notice those inconsistencies in other people. When we notice them in ourselves, right, we tend to experience some fairly intense frustration. That's the thing that'll get people into therapy a lot, right? Ambivalence, or a real, like a break, not ambivalence, but sort of an inability to allow some higher level decision to, right? It doesn't seem like they can overcome this lower level predictor thing that's operating, or this lower level tendency. So the modules can be at odds, right? But by and large, if you really trust it, you're willing to transparently reach through it. It forms the pattern of your own action. And actions are, of course, themselves predictive, right? So like, you know, I have some expectations about the way that my body is going to fit to the world, right? And I shape it accordingly. I have ideas about, right, how I'm going to be able to interact and use things. You know, when I put a cup of coffee to my lips, I'm expecting that delicious coffee taste, but I'm also expecting that this is not going to be a decaf cup of coffee, so it's going to work for me. I'm expecting that it's not going to be not coffee. Story in that respect, a guy I knew in high school who worked at a gas station, smart guy, and some of his coworkers were not that smart, and they decided that they were going to play a prank on him. It was a fairly pranky location, being as it was a gas station run by teenagers. So they pranked him, and they put Drano in his coffee. So you can imagine what they thought was going to happen, right? I mean, Drano's a clog remover. It's quite corrosive. So what they thought was going to happen, for sure, was they thought he was going to go, right? You guys, that's what they thought was going to happen. But that's not what happened, right? Because instead what happened is he took a big drink, and then this stuff started to like eat into him. Like, it's quite serious if you ingest Drano. He survived, and he's good. I think he became a chemical engineer, if I recall correctly. Interesting guy. Anyway, long and the short of it is, right, like there is a certain kind of prediction and modeling that I have about what's going to happen when I do this, and it doesn't include Drano. And if it suddenly did, I'd be in trouble, right? Well, okay, fine. So we have models, and the models determine how we interact with the world to a great extent, but they also determine the determinations we make about other agents in the world. Now, sometimes, like with our parents, those are both things that we want to be able to predict in the world, but also form the patterns of our own action. We plug that stuff in. It's only in rare conditions like dreams and that sort of thing where the module drifts out enough that we interact with it as an other so that we can practice skills. But it's not just that. It allows us to practice skills, but that kind of separation is the Nerathian bootstrap. If this stuff is tightly integrated, you can't operate on it, right? You can't make revisions to this. It's too entangled. It's too, right, entangled together. The functioning is all tied together. There's, right, you can't separate it out. You need to be able to isolate things and separate them out to operate on them relatively cleanly, right? You have to be able to expose something and not be dealing with the surrounding material. So think about surgery, right? You open somebody up for surgery, and all of a sudden, like, you don't want to have to be, you want everything else out of the way. You want a clear, clean, right? And the fact that it's connected to other things, you want to be able to minimize those effects. It's the same thing. When you separate something out, that is the Nerathian bootstrap. Dissociation is the Nerathian bootstrap, and it's the Nerathian bootstrap that lets you separate out a module, both so that you can test how good the mutual models are between. Are my interactions with this thing effective as a way of practicing your skills for the real world? But also, it allows you to revise it accordingly. Because when our models are wrong, we get a hit of, oh, my models are wrong, expectation violation. That pulls our attention, right? Which we know, expectation violation pulls our attention, will make us curious. As long as there's not too much of it, there has to be kind of a balance, right? But also, if the expectation violation is serious, it makes us revise what we think if something surprises us, right? Now, notice how that conforms to the dual sense of reality. It conforms to the dual sense of reality. John Vervaeke pointed out to me this particular gap in our conception of reality, right? This is sort of going to lead into some of this stuff. We take something to be real under two distinct conditions. We take something to be real if it conforms to our expectations, right? So if we walk outside and things basically conform to our expectations, they do what we expect, we take them to be real, right? If suddenly they're doing something that seems like it's not conforming to what we expect, we question if it's real. We walk outside and the mailbox is floating, we're gonna give it a shake. If we're the only one there, what are we gonna do? We're gonna maybe interact if we're not too nervous. We're gonna get close and see what we can figure out if it's not dangerous. We're going to consult with other people. We're going to try to get intersubjective correlation going, right? And, you know, notice, right, a certain amount of that, a certain amount of intersubjective agreement, and people will take it seriously even if they haven't directly experienced it. So this is the old thing, right? You're at a house party and your friend runs in and says, holy shit, I just saw a unicorn in the woods. And if it's just him, you're like, Tim, you're high. If on the other hand, two of your friends run in, especially if they run in separately, but two of your friends run in and say, oh, shit, I just saw a unicorn in the woods, you might be like, whatever, you guys are playing a prank, so you're deliberately lying. Or you might be like, okay, whatever, like maybe you saw something, but it's just two people and whatever. Or if they're together, you'll be like, okay, this is folie à deux. But if three of your friends come in, and especially if they come in separately, and they're like, there's a goddamn unicorn in the woods, I guarantee you're going to go look. You're going to go seek further evidence because intersubjective agreement, right? You're going to go see this thing for yourself. If right, so you're going to take it seriously, serious enough to investigate. So expectation violation, or sorry, expectation confirmation, right? Meeting what you expect about reality is one of the ways that you take things to be real, right? That everything behaves the way it's supposed to. But another meaning that we have for reality, okay, another way that we think of reality, another criterion that we set on what's real is expectation violation. So the reality has a way of breaking in, right? It breaks in to what you expect, your routine, right? You may notice that we are all right now in a situation that I don't think any of us really actually anticipated, right? It's a big, jarring shock. And yeah, it creates this strange sense of like absurd unreality, like, whoa, this is how, but as it settles in, we're like, holy shit, like that's real. And why do we take it that way? Why do we take it to be real in that way? We take it to be real in that way because it slaps us across the face and shows us that the models that we were operating were not as accurate as we thought they were, right? The projection that we had about what's going to happen tomorrow, right? That we had set, calibrated to, right, some degree of certainty, but that, you know, like effectively speaking, I bet people did not think they were going to be spending a month inside or longer. Right? They didn't think that. And so the fact that that thing has come in is like, this is a thing. This is real. This is happening, right? And it produces this transcendent, this Durkbruch, this breakthrough kind of experience. And that also has a powerful sense of reality attached to it. So this idea, right, that of the expectation confirmation, but also expectation violation that happens is an important double sense of reality that goes on when we separate a module out and we're interacting with it. To the extent that it violates expectation, we want to be paying attention to that. To the extent that it conforms to expectation, we want to be paying attention to that. That means like, oh, okay, we basically got it right when we're testing it, right? Okay. Now, as I already mentioned, expanding on this because I want to sort of set this up appropriately, systemic dissociation that's already occurring with the system occurs routinely. If you're daydreaming, you're dissociating. If you're watching TV, you're dissociating. You're dissociating when you look at a book. There are different kinds of dissociation, but the point is there's a general drift between capacities, right? You're obviously not as conscious when you're watching TV. A fact that was taken up at some length and serious criticism in Mandler's book, 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television, a good book from the 70s about 4 arguments for the elimination of television, if that wasn't clear. So yeah, you're not as conscious if you're watching TV because you're dissociated, right? Some of your functions are just offline. Advertisers are relying on that, I add, right? Because things sneak past. You're not as sort of conscious and vigilant. Likewise, when you're in a peak state, you're highly conscious, but if you're sort of like half out of it, clumsy, like moving through your day, right? If you happen to suffer from dissociation as like a side effect of emotional pain or emotional trauma, you may be quite used to hitting circumstances where things hit you and all of a sudden your feelings are gone, right? You're sort of looking at the world in this teeny way and see how that can affect, right? Changes in this kind of integration can affect all kinds of things around your processing. So suddenly the world is derealized, right? That's a common dissociative effect, derealization, right? So the world seems less real. Depersonalization, you don't feel quite right? You don't feel like there's anything there, right? There's a sense of kind of an emptiness or like, who am I, right? There's an instability that comes with that kind of dissociation. You may just suddenly find that there are circumstances, right, where your feelings drop out, right? You just don't have access, or where you tune out completely. If you're talking to someone who's dissociated, and sometimes you'll hit something and they'll just glaze right over, they tune right out, right? They're no longer in contact. They're no longer in contact with reality because things have pulled apart. Okay, so that's routine, that's happening all the time. And likewise, dream, right? A dissociative process, right? And the coming together, that's just happening all the time in the brain between different areas. Although between some areas, more and less so. So when I gave you the example of literacy, literacy is tying together two areas that aren't normally tied together. That's why we have to drill it and train it. Conventional language, you just drop a kid in a room full of language and they'll acquire language if they're the right age. But literacy, we have to drill them, we have to sit them in desks, we have to wrap things on the board and practice, and right until it becomes automatic. But what happens is we hit the two areas over and over and over again, right? And gradually they thicken up their connections. What fires together wires together, and neuroplastically they become so tightly integrated that we can rely on that tightness of integration for the Stroop effect. Okay, so you see why I'm hitting this drum over and over again. Okay, so, but that tells us something also. It tells us this. The natural processes of the brain are going through this all the time. It's very probable, in my opinion, that what's happening in dream is likewise doing this, a kind of Neurathian bootstrap. But we also know that you can test the efficacy of hypnosis. And you can test the efficacy of hypnosis by testing its inhibition of the Stroop effect. That is to say that you can intentionally dissociate two areas that would normally be quite tightly integrated. And that seems like it's sort of a general application tool. This is not the only thing that hypnosis can do, right? So what's hypnosis? Well, hypnosis is attentional direction, right? And it's language driven and it's imagination driven. Typically there's mental imagery involved, right? A bunch of these things. And you lead somebody through sort of a set of suggestions, words and visualizations, and through a certain amount of attentional control, you can put somebody in a state of suggestibility where you separate these areas out. But that's intentional, right? That's the key thing here. It's intentional. You can't suppress your Stroop effect through sheer intention, but you can suppress it through a technique like hypnosis, which dissociates the two areas. So why does that matter? Because what that means is that, right, you can use hypnosis as a Neurathian bootstrap. You can use dissociation as the Neurathian bootstrap, and you can induce the dissociation through things like hypnosis. Now, why does that matter? Well, that matters because, bringing this back around to the magical practice thing, right? You can theoretically, right, combine together things like tables of correspondence and your attentional control, but you can also do things like isolate these modules of your mind and interact with them, right? You can isolate these modules of your mind and interact with them. So suddenly, right, you can tease out some component of your mind and talk to it as though it's a person. You can bring the same machinery to bear as you would bring talking to another person, waking or in a dream. And your social machinery is powerful machinery. The machinery that you use day to day to process people is powerful. So what if instead you could use that machinery to interact with your concept of justice? What if you could do that, right? Okay, now here's the thing. We've already talked about how there are sort of multiple different types, in a sense, okay, of mutual models. And these turn up in dreams too, right? There's people you know, right, who are just people you know. And then there's sort of generalized others, right? Oh, that person's sneaky and spooky and dark and scary, right? Or it's like, yeah, there was a girl there. There was a beautiful woman there. There was an old man. There was whatever, right? Types of people, okay? And then there's that funny middle ground. And I talked about that funny middle ground. It's the funny middle ground of celebrities that your brain thinks you know, but you don't actually know, and fictional characters. Okay. So there's that middle ground. They turn up in dreams too, right? Now here's the thing. That middle ground is powerful ground. And it's powerful ground, right, to be able to intentionally use processes of internalization. When we talk about internalization, the Vygotskyan sense, okay, Vygotsky talks about, the Soviet developmental psychologist, right, is the person who talked about the zone of proximal development, but he also talked about the internalization, right, that we internalize adult behaviors, right, and that's part of the function of play, to bring this back to play. So we internalize our parents, right? We've already talked about this with mutual modeling. But Vervaeke and Ferraro, as part of their work on wisdom, also discussed the concept of internalizing the sage. Now, what does that mean, internalizing the sage? Okay, well, you can look at this pretty easily by looking at those Christian bumper stickers. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? Now, most people often look at those and think they're sort of vaguely corny, and probably there's an assumption that really actually Christians are not paying close attention to that, because most Christians, right, that don't seem to respect Christian virtues especially strongly, right? You consider, right, that the Pope lives in a giant building full of art, and don't get me wrong, I have a lot of respect for religious persons, but the Pope lives in a giant fancy building full of art and gold, and Jesus, in the actual published Gospels, which are only a few of the books that were sort of on the potential docket to be in the Bible, like a council decided this stuff in the year 300 and something. So Jesus only argues for a few things. He argues for Gnostic contact with the divine. He argues for programmatic homelessness, and he argues for radical egalitarianism. Those are like the three big things in his program. There's a few other little bits, but radical egalitarianism and programmatic homelessness are like, give all your shit away to the poor, right? He says this over and over and over again. Give all your stuff away and then wander from town to town, living off charity and preaching the word of the kingdom. It's not hard to see how that's compatible with living in a giant house full of art. A house that is a city that is a country, I add. But anyway, I'm not picking the Pope out particularly. I think that in general, we're not especially good at following the sort of ethical dictates of the religions that we purport to follow, right? There's, in fact, a distinction between our modules and between what we really think. But the point is, when you look at the bumper sticker, what would Jesus do? That is a question that's intended to prompt you to consult your model. It's intended to prompt you to consult the model. Now, this is interesting in some ways. There are studies, for instance, that show that if you give somebody an ethically loaded question of some kind, okay, so a difficult decision to make, they will find it hard to make to the extent that you make it personal, right? That's a pretty well-known finding. But you can also help them overcome that problem by getting them to consult somebody in their mind who they think is wise. So you ask them to consult. They're like, well, think of somebody that that you consider to be wise. What do you think that person would advise you to do? And all of a sudden, people's performance and abilities in these tasks goes up dramatically. If they step outside of themselves, it goes up dramatically, right? And if they sort of consult an inner construction that they consider wise, right? They're narrowing their focus down to this one component. You consider this component wise, what would it do? Now notice how we model ourselves off role models all the time. We model ourselves off role models, right? Role models are our heroes. Who's my hero, right? And what do? We emulate them. Often, in fact, in sort of ridiculous ways, right? We'll pick up affectations, we'll pick up, styles of clothing, right? Like things that are incidental to what has made that person sort of effective and who they are. But we'll do that kind of stuff routinely, right? Styles of dress all the time, right? And fashion, of course, is a hilarious version of this. There's like a status cascade that happens with fashion. I'm sure all of you are familiar, of course, with the origination of wearing one's pants in a very low-slung fashion. And it's not clear that that is like a well-known fact if you look, in fact, at the current version of people wearing their pants in that fashion. It always seems hard to walk. I know that makes me an old man. At this point, that just makes me like, get off my lawn. I don't feel that way. I wouldn't want to wear my pants that way. It seems uncomfortable and difficult. So I often find fashion puzzling in that way. That and asymmetrical skirts really bug me. Anyway, that's beside the point. The point that I'm getting at is this, right? What would Jesus do is a prompt to an internalization. And the religious practice is meant to take you through these stories about his behavior and his thoughts and his whatever over and over and over again until you have them on tap. And the idea, right, there are, for example, significant Christian texts like the imitation of Christ. The idea is you are supposed to spiritually place yourself into these circumstances. You're supposed to embody it, right? And that's the whole thing with the religious participatory ritual, right? You consume the body and thus are subsumed into the shared experience, right? And what would Jesus do is an effort to consult the model that you've built that you consider to be wiser than yourself. And before you're like, well, why would I consider it to be wiser than myself, right? kids, remember we talked about the box that had the chimpanzee and the kid, and the box had like dials and buttons and whatever, and you could pull the little tray out and get for the kid a candy and for the chimp a peanut. And if it's opaque, right, they both learn the sequence really quickly. But if the box is transparent, the chimp looks at you like you're a moron and pulls the peanut out without doing any of that other garbage, because it can tell that they're not connected processes causally, right? The kid will keep going through that sequence. Why? It's a bet on culture. The kid can't see because there isn't a reason. The kid can't see it, but they're making a bet that there's a good reason that you're doing it that they don't know yet. And we internalize stuff of that kind constantly, right? Culture is littered with this kind of stuff, right? And you know, just general artifacts, right? Things hang on for a long time as traditions. Like, well, here's a good example. This is what I talk about sometimes. So this is what I sometimes call a mimeograph problem. It's an almost unique to U of T kind of problem that I think is quite interesting. Okay, so what's a mimeograph problem? Okay, so at U of T, if you go to another university, if you go to like York or something, okay? So John from Feki and I were talking about this. And so John was teaching philosophy courses up at York for a few years ago, a number of years ago. And so that's fine. So he's coming up on the final exam. And he says to his supervisor, like, hey, do you need me to send, it's a few weeks before the end of the semester, do you need me to send a copy of my final exam over, right? And the supervisor says, no, why? And John's like, oh, don't you need it like before the exam? And the supervisor's like, no, just print it off and bring it to the exam room. Okay, makes sense. Now, U of T, you have to submit your final exam. If you have a final exam, you need to submit your final exam, the text of it, several weeks in advance. Now, that causes problems because, let's say, the speed of your lecture and stuff, right? It's hard to predict exactly how much material, especially if you're me, but it's hard to predict exactly how much of your material you're going to get through. So how do you know whether or not you're going to get through a particular subject? So what do? Well, if you don't know for sure if you're going to get through something in that final class, you tend to leave it off the exam, right? Because, oh, what if we don't get through it? Then that wouldn't be fair, right? So you leave it off. And this is because you have to submit your exam in advance. So here's the thing. Why do you have to submit your exam in advance? Why? So it turns out the reason that you have to submit your exam in advance at U of T is it has nothing to do with them vetting it or checking it over or putting it in an archive or any of the things that you might anticipate. The reason you have to put your exam in several weeks in advance is to give them time to mimeograph it. What's mimeographing, you ask me? What's mimeographing? Well, a mimeograph is an early print mass replication technology where you basically, I think you put typeset onto a drum and then you paint it with purple ink, and then you take sheets of paper and you turn the crank and the paper, and it prints copies. It's a way of printing copies. A way of printing copies that precedes modern computing, modern printing, modern Xerox, which is not a new technology, photocopiers, right? Mimeographing. That's the reason. But see, the reason has just hung on. We all continue to do it imitatively, and just nobody's changed that particular rule. It's a mimeograph problem. You encounter these in big organizations a lot. You know, like countries that have old laws on the books. Like technically, I believe it is still legal to shoot a Scotsman with a bow if they are within bow shot of the walls of the city of York in England. I believe that is still technically legal. And, you know, you can find all these books full of old laws and things, right? That's kind of the social version of what we're talking about. But, you know, to a certain extent, right, to a certain extent, right, the internalizations you undertake, when the kid makes a bet on continuing the sequence of things with the transparent box, right, they're making a bet that the internalized pattern is wiser than they are, that it knows something that they don't. That's the human bet. So what would Jesus do is a bet that the model that you have internalized of this figure, Jesus, right, knows better than you do. And before you localize this to Christians, right, it's all over the place, right? So the Epicureans famously put up the sayings of Epicurus, right? Like in and around their homes. So they would encounter them daily so that they would be sort of like saturated right, with Epicurean wisdom. You can see the same kind of thing when we make any kind of like interior consult, right? To consult our Buddha nature, for instance, is a very similar kind of concept, right? To pray or speak to our soul or listen for the voice of whatever are, again, this attempt to contact. So this is actually a very common kind of maneuver that we use, this internalizing the sage, right? It's an attempt to actively use techniques to build a little model of the sage, of the wise person, right? And then use that as something that we consult. So internalizing the sage. Now, part of what's interesting about that is the sage falls into that funny middle category. They're not a generalized other for the most part, nor are they somebody you know for the most part. They're in that middle category of people that like you seem like you should know because you encounter them all the time, and people who are fictional. And for the most part, most sages, for most of us, are fictional. Like we encounter them in a primarily fictional fashion, right? So in that sense, Jesus, right? The Jesus that most people encounter, and I'm excluding here the possibility of the reality of direct contact with a spiritual experience, that kind of thing. I'm just saying within a naturalistic framework, the Jesus that people encounter is a book. He's a story, maybe some films, maybe some cartoons. It sort of depends on the exposure, but mostly he's a book. He's a set of stories, he's text. He's a character, right? Now, people often interpret that to be a negative assessment, that he's a character. But I don't think it is, because characters move the world all the time. My mom used to ask me, my mom's a Catholic, and my mom used to ask me, we'd be on car trips or whatever, and she would say to me, Anderson, do you think Jesus was real? Like, do you think he was a really real person? And this idea, really real, right? And I had a bunch of different answers when I was a kid. And then finally I got old enough and I was like, I don't know. I'm not sure that that's knowable, but it doesn't really matter because that isn't the level on which you interact with it anyway. The only Jesus you've ever interacted with is the narrative Jesus, right? And the imagistic Jesus, okay? But the narrative Jesus. You've encountered him as a series of stories, right? And stories where he says things that are sometimes confusing and where he does things that are sort of morally charged and whatever, like he's a powerful figure and a somewhat confusing one. Like he's not, you actually start reading the stuff and you realize it's like, oh, wow, this is not a simple character, right? And the same thing goes for most of these major figures, right? So before we're quick to say like, well, maybe Jesus was just fictional. The thing is that fictional character has hung around. Let's say he's totally fictional. Let's say he has no historical basis, right? And let's be honest, there isn't a lot of direct archaeological evidence for Jesus, right? Not a lot. There's a little and it's mixed, but there isn't a ton, okay? And he's not thoroughly documented in the records of the Romans or anything, right? I think the first historical reference he gets is in Josephus, and that's like 80 CE or something, right? So he doesn't make a huge splash in the historical archaeological record at the time. It's his adherents later picking up in the Roman Empire or whatever that start to spread that, right? And by then, he is to them what? He's narrative, he's a story. But that story swept across a continent and then a planet. Billions of people have been moved by that story. That story, right, and the imitation of that story has inspired acts of altruism, acts of cruelty. It's inspired, right, tremendous sort of outreach and care and so on and so forth. Like if you read the lives of the saints, some of the things that people have done in the imitation of this figure, this character, right, are tremendous, right? And the character has been around now for 2,000 years. And you know what? I'm going to make a firm bet. Long after you and me and all the people we know are dead, that character will still be around. Now, I'm sort of like half Christian originally, right? But I don't have a close connection. Although I have a lot of respect for that material, but it's not sort of resonant for me personally. I don't have a lot of space to get into this, but I had an experience once, a mystical experience, where in fact I was doing, to some extent, Kabbalistic work. And I went to Tiphareth, the realm of the resurrecting solar gods. And so, of course, you get up to that realm and you expect maybe that what you're going to encounter there is like, well, Jesus, that would make sense. I went to Catholic school as a kid, and right, Jesus, or maybe one of the like golden oldies, so to speak, Mithras, right? Or like Ra, the sun god or something, right? I'm going to get some resurrecting god. And so anyway, I get there. Who do I encounter, you ask? And as soon as I do, I think, of course I do. Of course I do. Because who else? This has been hugely important to me since I was tiny. I used to wear a Superman suit under my clothes as a little kid. Like a lot. It got brought for me by my grandparents from England. It was very important to me. Like this has an extremely powerful effect on me. And Superman is, of course, as a story, is, you know, space Jesus Moses, right? That's why he came back from the dead. He's like Moses, right? His family put him in a basket and they send him downriver, which is to say they stick him in a rocket. His parents are scientists. They stick him in a rocket and send him to Earth to save him when Krypton explodes because people won't pay attention to environmental data. Yeah, right. And then, of course, he grows up. And what's his story? Lots of people think Superman is boring, but I think that represents something of a failure of the imagination. Because the thing is that his story isn't one, it's not like, say, Batman. Batman's traumatized, right? That's the idea, right? Batman is something horrible happens. And we all sort of have the vague idea that if Batman's parents hadn't been killed when he was 8, he'd be an asshole, right? He'd be a plutocratic asshole. He would be the guy that he pretends to be when he doesn't have the mask on, right? So that sort of forged him into something more, but we get the impression he maybe wouldn't be a great person if it weren't for that. And a lot of heroes have that going for them, right? Even Peter Parker is kind of a schlub, but until he feels so horrible about Uncle Ben's death, he doesn't really like take the Spider-Man role. But Superman's story is, yeah, he's Space Jesus Moses. He gets launched to Earth, and they don't really know he's an alien, and he doesn't really know he's an alien. And then when he's around 12 years old, he suddenly discovers that he's the most powerful being on Earth. He was raised by nice, older Midwestern parents in Kansas values or whatever, a farm kid. And so when he's 12, he discovers he's the most powerful being on Earth. And he decides to help people, not because he's traumatized, but because it's the right thing to do. And people find that boring a lot of the time. They're like, that's not interesting. And it's like, and it's not realistic, people will say. And it's like, really? It's not realistic? You can sort of accept within the fiction a guy that can lift a battleship over his head, but you can't accept the idea of somebody that's morally superior to you. Like, come on. So, okay, so this is the figure I encountered when I reached the solar sphere of Tipperath. Now, that whole thing is a story for another day. I think I may have told it in a YouTube video at another point. I may have told it in one of my Iboga lectures. I think maybe I did, actually. So you can track that down if you're really interested. But the point is this. I have that figure internalized. I have it internalized. I could tell you what would Superman say? What would Superman do? I can tell you that pretty easily, right? Okay, so in the interest of sort of time and continuity, and because I lost a bunch of time in the posting, although damn it, I have the technical support. I'm going to get this nailed for next week. Let me tell you, nailed. Okay, so I'm going to head things off there, but I'm going to use that as an intro because talking about the internalization of the sage in the Vervaekian sense is going to lead us into this final bit and the attentional control, all these pieces. So when I roll it out in the lecture for next week, I'm going to try to stitch the whole shebang together, end to end, all of the pieces that I've given you so far. I would encourage you to read a bunch of things, and I'll post a couple more things. I know I keep saying I'm going to do that. It's been an exceptionally busy period for obvious reasons. I know it has been for you guys too. Yes, and but I'm going to try to put the last of this together, and so that you can get a sense of kind of the end-to-end scope of what I'm talking about, because what we're going to move towards is putting all these pieces together: the unconscious, the psychodynamic nature of the unconscious, altered states, all these pieces around integration and dissociation, structural systems, right, and character work and all that stuff, and we're going to try to put it together into a practical model of change. Practical model of change, and one that you'll see is in fact underlying the practical model of change that we see in things like psychotherapy and things like certain spiritual traditions and in things like magical practice. It's already implicit in there. It's already implicit in there. But what we're going to do is try to explicate it, and in so doing, I'm going to try to unpack, you know, the grand scheme, right? The grand scheme of what it is that we're talking about in this course and the argument that I'm trying to make for you. So, yes, I hope that all goes smoothly. Maybe I'll record it on the weekend. That would probably be the prudent thing to do. Then I can edit it and put special effects and lightning bolts and stuff. Again, that'd be good. Okay, good. Thank you for your attention and your patience. I will see people in office hours tomorrow. They start at 10, they run until noon, okay? And they will be this live option business. I'm saying this, but this actual thing isn't live. Anyway, so, right, if you need a specific time slot, you need to ping me and let me know, and we'll either speak before or after, okay? But otherwise, we will just it'll be open season. It's going to be great. Okay, good. Thank you again for your patience, and I want you to remember that Superman was alive before you were, and he's going to outlive you too. So who's realer, him or you?